Hey everybody, how's it going? Thank you all for joining me once again for this critical Let's Play of Dear Esther. I think this is going to be a really good one. Last time we were talking a lot about how the game introduces all of its themes and its gameplay in particular, with the level design setting up this idea of exploration as the main tenet of the gameplay, with all the different paths at the beginning back there. And then we also talked a little bit about how it begins to set up this idea between the gameplay, the sound design, and art design, that the narrator is seeking to connect with other people, potentially through these repeated instances where he sees somebody off in the distance, but it's always an illusion. There's nobody ever there. And so in this Let's Play, we're going to be finishing up Chapter 1. We're going to get to see the second, or what I would consider the second beach of the game, and we can talk a little bit more about like the motif of these beaches in the game. And then we get to see kind of like the first cave in the game, which should be pretty cool because those are very important in Chapter 3 in particular. That's enough of setting up. We're going to trigger this next audio segment right up here.
When you were born, your mother told me a hush fell over the delivery room. A great red birthmark covered the left side of your face. No one knew what to say, so you cried to fill the vacuum. I always admired you for that you cried to fill whatever vacuum you found. I began to manufacture vacuums just to enable you to deploy your talent. The birthmark faded by the time you were 6 and had gone completely by the time we met, but your fascination with the empty and its cure remained.
So in this segment of the monologue, we're getting this focus on the vacuum, as he calls it, or the void, as I was calling it in the previous Let's Play, which seems to take a pretty big role in the story here. We seem to get this idea that the narrator has lost his sense of purpose, and the void is typically representing that. Now, I just wanted to comment on this, even though I don't have a whole lot to say about it. It's a Fibonacci spiral, and I don't really know what that means in the context of the story. It might just be a spiral with like this little symbol on the end of it, but I've thought in the past that it could be like a map of the island, which would be interesting if it was, but other than that, I don't really know what it's supposed to represent. It seems like it's very deliberately placed in your path, so you're supposed to see it, but yeah, I don't really have any great ideas about what it's supposed to be. So if anybody has ideas about that symbol, then let me know. And so now up ahead, I'm just going to trigger the next segment of monologue, and we'll head back the other way.
Dear Esther, I found myself to be as featureless as this ocean, as shallow and unoccupied as this bay, a listless wreck without identification. My rocks are these bones, and a careful fence to keep the precipice at bay. Shot through me caves, my forehead a mount. This aerial will transmit into me so. All overexposed, the nervous system, where Donnelly's boots and yours and mine still trample. I will carry a torch for you. I will leave it at the foot of my headstone. You will need it for the tunnels that carry me under.
So in this part of the monologue, the narrator seems to be delving more into these contradictions that, as we see more and more into this game, he seems to be embracing these contradictions more and more, and it becomes unclear as we go along what the real story is. He seems to confuse himself with other characters in his own story, and he creates these kind of nonsensical parallels. Like he begins here talking about how the island and himself are one and the same thing, talking about himself as the tunnels in a way, and all of that, and kind of reversing the roles of himself and his wife, and as if his wife were alive and he's the dead one. And so I think those contradictions play a big role in the game, and I think it goes along with the thing that I was saying in the first part of this Let's Play, that the narrator seems to believe that knowledge has failed him, and that the pursuit of knowledge is in a way useless and purposeless. Going along with that same idea of the void, and yeah, I think the contradictions really play into that. And there aren't really any facts that you can really discern from the story. Everything is up for interpretation. And here, I just wanted to point out that for the first time, we're seeing pieces of a car. And this is randomized, so here we're getting a door and just another door, but sometimes it will be more involved. You'll get like an axle and things like that, wheel maybe. And I think this plays into another interpretation of the island as like the moment when the cars collided and killed his wife, is the island kind of representing that car crash, and the narrator dealing with his wife's death and what happened in that car crash. And the narrator actually says this at one point. He says he questions whether or not the island first came to exist when the car crash happened. And so I think that's playing into the idea that maybe this island doesn't exist at all. And that's certainly the way I interpret it, although I know other people interpret it in different ways. And now, as we're walking back, I guess I'll just take this as an opportunity to talk about the control scheme of the game, which I think is fairly interesting and plays into some of the themes in the game. So if you've played on the computer, you'll know that the controls are, WASD to move, and the mouse to look, which is all pretty standard. But then we have these interact keys, or what I would typically consider the interact keys, being E and click, left click. And as you can see, the only thing that those two do is this kind of zoom. And I think that's kind of giving like a gentle nudge, saying like, trying to express this idea that the gameplay is more about looking around and all that, rather than solving puzzles or shooting people or anything like that. And so I think that's interesting, because I don't see buttons used in very meaningful ways all the time. And I think it's definitely a place that video games can uniquely draw upon for meaning. The only game that I know that's really done this well is Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, but I won't spoil that game. But if you've played, you know that in the control scheme, there's on one half of the controller, you're playing as the older brother, and one half you're playing as the younger brother, and then at a certain point, those kind of mesh together, and it becomes symbolic of the relationship between the brothers. And so I think it's definitely an area that games could definitely begin to experiment with, this symbolism through buttons. And then the last thing that I wanted to say at this point is last time we fell down here, and that's where we kind of ended the video. But I did want to point out that there was a similar gap just before this that we were able to cross, and that was kind of like the first challenge of the game. And then immediately they're setting up this place that looks almost exactly the same and making you believe that you can cross that, but you can't. It's impossible to cross this way, to move forward, and you have to slide down there. And so that's kind of another way where they're setting up these expectations and immediately kind of refuting them. And so I think that could kind of play into the same thing of, hopelessness in the gameplay, but that one's a little more tenuous.
Reading Donnelly by the weak afternoon sunlight. He landed on the south side of the island, followed the path to the bay and climbed the mount. He did not find the caves, and he did not chart the north side. I think this is why his understanding of the island is flawed, incomplete. He stood on the mount and only wondered momentarily how to descend. But then, he didn't have my reasons.
Okay, so in that section of the monologue, he mentions Donnelly's work and how it's flawed, and I think that's kind of playing into the thing that I mentioned in the beginning of the first Let's Play of how these letters to the narrator's wife seem to be more academic than something that you'd write to a loved one. Saying that somebody's work is flawed is usually an opening to an academic article. Establishing what work has already been done on a certain subject, and then proposing what could be improved upon that, and why you're writing the thing that you're writing. And so in the first Let's Play, I was talking about how this is playing into that whole idea of the narrator being more obsessed with the idea of all these different pursuits of knowledge rather than the actual death of his wife. It seems that the death of his wife kind of provoked this depression that has much more to do with other things in the narrator's life, like finding purpose and all of that, rather than just the death. And so I stopped because I didn't want to be triggering this dialogue, or this monologue, I'm sorry, about the white lines.
When someone had died or was dying, or was so ill they gave up what little hope they could sacrifice, they cut parallel lines into the cliff, exposing the white chalk beneath. You could see them from the mainland or the fishing boat, and know to send aid or impose a cordon of protection, and wait a generation until whatever pestilence stalked the cliff paths died along with its hosts. My lines are just for this, to keep any would-be rescuers at bay. The infection is not simply of the flesh.
So once again, we're getting this kind of motif of illness, and illness, I think, plays a very similar role to all of the whole focus on death in general. But I think that there is this additional meaning to this idea of illness as kind of alienation. Here he's talking about how, warning people that there was something that was sick on the island would keep people at bay. He's reinforcing that idea of these illnesses as alienation, and we see that all these different characters who are labeled as hermits at some point in the script, Jakobsen, Donnelly, and the narrator, all are claim to have some serious illness at some point. And so I think it's playing into that, and this is also kind of indulging in these contradictions that the narrator talks about a lot, where it's simultaneously, these white lines are simultaneously a warning to stay away from the island, as well as a call for help. And that's potentially a reference to the narrator's depression, and making these signs and hoping that, not knowing if he's hoping to keep people away, or that they'll know that he's in trouble and needs help. And that's all I really have to say about that. I also wanted to point out that the aerial is once again taking a focal point in the landscape, which he points out in the script at this point too, in other versions of the script. And I think that's kind of keeping you focused on what the end goal really is. And here you get a glimpse of this stone structure, this ancient stone structure that we're going to come across later, once again setting up a goal for the player.
We are not like Lot's wife, you and I. We feel no particular need to turn back. There's nothing to be seen if we did. No tired old man parting the cliffs with his arms. No gifts or Bibles laid out on the sand for the taking. No tides turning or the shrieking gulls overhead. The bones of the hermit are no longer laid out for the taking. I have stolen them away to the guts of this island, where the passages all run to black, and where we can light each other's faces by their strange luminescence.
So the Bible also plays a big role in the script, and I've talked about that as kind of playing into that idea of just another pursuit of knowledge. But I think there is more to it than that. There are a lot of biblical references in this, and that doesn't particularly interest me. I think biblical references are a little overused, but the only thing that I get out of them is that I think that the narrator seems to think of himself as kind of like a Christ-like figure, and kind of pity himself in that way. I think it's not so much that he's a good person, but more that he believes that he's doing this self-sacrifice, trying to communicate with people by throwing himself off the radio tower. And yeah, so now we're going to trigger Paul.
Dear Esther, I met Paul. I made my own little pilgrimage. My Damascus, a small semi-detached on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. We drank coffee in his kitchen and tried to connect to one another. Although he knew I hadn't come in search of an apology, reason, or retribution, he still spiraled in panic, thrown high and lucid by his own dented bonnet. Responsibility had made him old. Like us, he'd already passed beyond any conceivable boundary of life.
Yeah, so at this point, we're getting to hear more about Paul, and it seems like the narrator has tried to communicate with Paul, who's the man that they crashed with, and the man who killed his wife, following the death of his wife. And so we hear that they tried to connect with one another, and that seems to play into this this theme of communication with the radio tower, and illness and alienation and all of that. Being on an island being another example of alienation and isolation, kind of separating themselves from one another. So there definitely seems to be this battle between trying to connect with other people but being isolated at the same time. Now at this point, I wanted to point out that this is kind of what I consider the second beach, although there isn't really sand, and I don't think the script considers this the second beach, but this is the second access point to the water for sure, and I know it's the place where I first entered the water and tried to swim out there, because you see these kind of points of interest off in the distance. You see the lighthouse again, but you also see this big crashed boat, and it's just off in the distance, and it looks like it could be reachable. And that, in addition to the fact that the ground kind of sweeps down in this direction, I think it is kind of drawing you in, and maybe trying to make you experience this, and trying to make you die, because as we move into the water, we're going to submerge, and then our character dies, and there's this kind of reset. And so I think you're intended to see this, and at this point, if not just at other points in the game, but I think this place is definitely where it seems most intriguing to go in. And so at multiple points in the game, they try to make you feel like you'll want to go into these dangerous situations that will kill the player character, and maybe putting you more in the shoes of the character in that way, and so of wanting to kill himself. And so I find that interesting, a very good use of level design, trying to manipulate the player to act as the player character would. And so now I'm going to show this to you, where he'll submerge into the water, and then there's this mini scene. So we're getting flashes of city setting, maybe an aerial, and maybe potentially brain scans are in there. It's hard to really tell, but it seems to be um, representative of the crash. And then he says, "Come back," and it's unclear whether he's talking to Esther or himself there. Um, but you're ultimately it just resets, and you're not allowed to die at that point because the death has to have meaning. And then, or in the character's mind, it does. So then at this point, this is another case like we were talking about at the end of the first Let's Play, where the path leads forward, and then the path that the path is leading straight ahead to a dead end, but the path that you really have to go to proceed through the level and get to the end is actually backwards, kind of hidden under cover. So you'll see there that there are these rocks in the way that kind of block the path from sight there, and also that we're coming up. The path, that path is above us, and we're coming up towards it, so we can't really see down at it. So if I move this way, there's kind of like, as I see it, a momentum to paths. So if you're moving this way, you're likely to see this as the path, this direction as the path. But ultimately, we're going to be headed off in that direction, which you couldn't really see before. And so I think this is kind of brilliantly done, so that it forces the player or makes the player want to go this way and go to a dead end and kind of loop around, and then they'll see the second path. And we see this a couple times throughout the game. And you could see that as playing into...
This hermit, this seer, this distant historian of bones and old bread, where did he vanish to? Why? Asked the farmers. Why? Asked Jakobsen. Why bother with your visions at all, if you're just to throw your arms up at the cliff and let it close in behind you and seal you into the belly of the island, a museum shut to all but the most devoted?
Just to finish off what I was saying, so you could potentially interpret that as is that level design as playing into the idea that they want to create this idea that, or this feeling in the player that this kind of illusion that you're moving forward, potentially, but I'm not terribly convinced of that. Now here we heard about the hermit and the narrator's frustration with it, and the other people's frustration with the hermit. So he says, he makes a couple biblical references, I think. He mentions old bread, and I think fish and bread he mentions a lot, which I believe is a biblical reference, although it's not one that I'm very well aware of. And then he's yelling about, like, why bother with your visions at all, and I think that's a pretty direct statement of saying that, like, this knowledge is useless, and so it's directly playing into that theme, I think, and drawing that out more. Now he also says a museum shut to all, and I think that's an interesting contradiction, because museums are kind of defined by their openness to the public, and they're also is like a place of knowledge. Now, here's what I would consider the first cave. I mean, pretty clearly the first cave, but we'll get into the more serious cave in chapter 3. And on the walls, there are these really strange luminescent paintings, cave paintings of very what I would consider like these very big concepts, these very intellectual concepts. Like you'll get neurons and nerves, and here you're getting the chemical construct of alcohol once again, potentially some kind of modern art, I'm not totally sure, and then, or abstract art, I don't really know, and then it's either a tree or a nervous system. And I think the color scheme here is interesting to talk about, because that'll definitely play a big role in the third chapter, where we're getting these, like as he's mentioned, as he just mentioned, maybe 3 monologues ago, that he's mentioned this strange luminescence, and it seems surreal, this color scheme, and the fact that these images that he's created on these walls seem to glow. And so I think in chapter 3, that's where we really seem to be distancing ourselves from, or the narrator and the player character really seem to be distancing themselves from reality the most. And I think that's what this is trying to embody, this strange luminescent color schemes at that point, trying to show that the narrator has lost all connection with reality. And at this point, we see the place where he's previously made a camp on the island and written some letters. And yeah, like I was saying, I don't really know how to interpret this once again, similar to that thing that I was calling a nonsense symbol earlier. This, I've thought, is potentially modern art, and so you'd then have the kind of juxtaposition of art and science, or it's maybe psychologically related. Maybe it's supposed to be like an ink blot test. But yeah, if anybody has ideas about what that is, I'd be very interested. And what that is, I mean, I'm not terribly sure. I think it's either representing nature as a tree or the nervous system, maybe. He definitely mentions the nervous system a lot. And then we get randomized things on the ground in this cave. Sometimes I've seen clothes here. Once again, he's clearly packed up. And then over here, we'll sometimes get a paper boat in the water, which I find pretty interesting, because if you've played the game, which I hope you have at this point, you'll know that at the end of chapter, or in the middle of chapter 4, really, we see that the narrator has set these letters to his wife that he's turned into paper boats to sail in the ocean. And interesting, you see one here, which is potentially kind of messing with the order of time, if you assume that the time that you get to that point in chapter 4 is the point where the narrator released them. If you're to believe that, then it's kind of collapsing time a bit, where the narrator had to be there in chapter 4 to release them, but you're only in chapter 1. Or you could believe that the narrator released them on a previous visit, and they just still happen to be there in chapter 4 from last time. But then it is strange to see that it's all the way on the other side of the island. And so in that case, maybe a collapsing of space. And so in general, it seems to be a kind of nonsensical setup. And we see paper boats at some points in the caves as well. So very strange setups. Now, as we're walking back up, we're going to once again center the aerial or the radio tower to the center of our vision, and it's going to once again be making the player focus on that, showing him that's the goal. And also I believe that it could potentially be that the reminding the character of this idea of communication, this striving for communication. But at the same time, once you've played through the game, you'll know that this is where the player or the player character plans to commit suicide, and so it's potentially representing this idea that death is always looming over the character. So now we're going to trigger another little monologue. Not a terribly meaningful one to me, but as always, I'll let everybody listen.
The vegetation here has fossilized from the roots up. To think they once grazed animals here, the remnants of occupation being evidence to that. It is all sick to death. The water is too polluted for the fish, the sky is too thin for the birds, and the soil is cut with bones of hermits and shepherds. I've heard it said that human ashes make great fertilizer, that we could sow a forest from all that is left of your hips and ribcage, with enough left over to thicken the air and repopulate the bay.
So the only thing that I really have to point out in that one is I was mentioning before that the narrator has this kind of delusion that everything on the island is dead, that there are no birds, that there are no fish, and at this point he's saying that even the plant life that we're seeing all around us is fossilized, is just kind of the dead remnants of plants rather than actual plants. And so obviously that seems to be an unreliable statement, since the plants seem to be alive, and as we've seen before, there are birds in the sky. So I think it's really setting up this kind of idea that the narrator isn't reliable. Now, at this point, we've made it to that stone structure that we saw up there before, and I'm not really sure what civilization it's from. I would want to say Picts, but I don't think they were ever on the Hebrides. But I'll edit that into the video at this point, hopefully. And so once again, with the caves, we saw there were cave paintings, and this time we're seeing this ancient stone structure once again with a chemical a chemical diagram on it. So it seems to kind of collapse time and say that, all of this knowledge, we have all this knowledge, but we're still just cavemen, or we still haven't progressed, and kind of challenging this idea of progress, which is very popular in a lot of modern and postmodern literature and art in general, is this idea that we're always so obsessed with trying to move forward, make better technology and all of that, but a lot of art tries to make the counter statement that maybe none of it is actually doing any good for us. Maybe we're not really moving forward because of that. And then on the ground here, sometimes we'll get a Bible and I believe a chemistry textbook right next to each other. And so once again, kind of juxtaposing science and religion. And there does seem to be a tendency to kind of mesh and put science and religion, next to each other in the Chinese Rooms games. That's definitely a heavy theme in Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which is kind of like the spiritual successor to Dear Esther. There's a kind of an astronomy tower that's in this small rural town in England, and then on a nearby hill, there's an astronomy tower on one hill, and then on a nearby hill there's a church. And so there's a little bit of tension between the scientists and the religious community there. And so that's all I really have for this chapter. Up ahead we would just fall down a cliff, and then we'd trigger the end of chapter 2, but I'll leave it here. So thank you all for joining me. I hope you found this insightful, and I hope it was enjoyable. Please feel free to leave comments in the comment section below. I'd be happy to discuss the game with you guys, and let me know what you think about all that stuff that I didn't really have any clear ideas on. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next video. And also, we're probably going to get a sound trigger, I believe, as we're walking up, and that kind of brings me into how sound design works in this game. So we hear some clanking in the building, and we also see a shadow move by as we're moving up, and so it's kind of drawing our attention into this building.